What can we learn about the late Bronze Age from the works of Homer? Although for most of history, Homer's writings have just been thought of as pure fiction, they are much more than mythology. Homer's writings provide essential insights into the late Bronze Age. They help shape the development and thinking of modern archaeological approach to the Greek world. And finally, Homer's language offers insight into the Greek worldview. Homer's writings about the Trojan War are very influential in today's culture. We have 33 states in the United States that have cities or towns named after Troy. So the real question is, did it really happen? Did the war at Troy really happen? The issue with figuring something like this out is not that we have not enough data, but it's actually that we have too much data. There are many wars that happened in that area and that time period that could have been it. For one thing we know for sure is that, quote, from around 1200 BC onward, a series of upheavals and destructive conflicts occurred in the Near East, end quote. And that is a quote from Christopher Gray. So to learn more about what may have happened, we can look at some other evidence. So for example, we have some geological evidence. There are some samples of the earth around that part of the Mediterranean that show a layer of ash. So this could mean that there was some sort of volcanic eruption nearby. Many people think that this was near Thera. Thera is a place that is over 90 miles away from where Troy would have been, where the samples were taken. So this would mean there would have been a massive eruption. And this could have caused, in that time, many tidal waves, as well as clouds of poison gas and earthquakes. Another interesting thing is this could very well coincide with the story of the Exodus. So in the Exodus, they talk about 3 days of darkness. And it is thought that perhaps this were the clouds of ash were the 3 days of darkness. As well as in the Exodus, there's a story about, of course, the parting of the Red Sea, where Moses runs up to the Red Sea and God says he'll part it, and it parts. And so this could also be a result of this volcanic eruption. Somehow, if the waves, if the water were to be affected, it could have kind of dried out an area of the ocean there. It is also thought that there are many encoded or exaggerated references to actual stories in Homer's writings, which could help give us a hint to their validity. So, for example, the Trojan horse. This is a very famous story. This is a very iconic story, but perhaps it isn't meant to be taken literally. So, it is thought that in that time there would have been a disease called anthrax that would have been rampant, and this was something that came from horses, and it was very deadly. So perhaps instead of a literal Trojan horse, it was kind of just like the end of the war. So you would have had the Greeks getting very sick with this disease. So in order to escape it, they just decided let's leave all our horses here and just get on the boats and go back home. So now the Trojans have been locked up in the city the whole time. And so what they're probably thinking is they want some food, because it's very hard to get shipments into a city when you're under siege, even though there were the Greeks weren't the best, from what I remember. It was still 10 years long, so they would have been hungry at that point. They may have come out and seen all the horses left behind and eat the horses and died from the disease, as well as the natural disasters that I previously talked about, which they would have been ill-equipped to handle if they were all sick, and that could have been contributing to them being wiped out. On to point 2. Homer influenced archaeological exploration of Bronze Age Greek in the modern times. Greece. So first person, I'm going to talk about a man named Heinrich Schliemann, I think is how you say it. Heinrich Schliemann. He was a wealthy businessman, and he loved Homer very much. He actually decided that it was true, and he was so sure that it was true. And due to the help of another man, he was able to find this large mound that he thought contained the city of Troy. It was called Hisarlik. And so he decided he was going to excavate this mound. So essentially what he did was he just dug right through the mound in giant trenches, which was very bad, and he probably destroyed a lot of things. But he still found a lot of artifacts. And it is thought that this was the site of Troy now. But his findings in this time contributed to kind of a wave of archaeological exploration of the Bronze Age, civilizations in the Aegean area. And this is due to his discoveries of supposedly Troy. Although Homer's writings may be layered with legend, or may not be entirely correct, we can also learn important facts about the Bronze Age collapse, which was kind of like an age of, the Bronze Age was an age of development, and this was the age that was begun to be excavated after Heinrich Schliemann. And we can learn a lot about this age and its collapse from Homer. So first, what was it? It was kind of an age of very high development, and it was named after the popularity of bronze, which was a metal used a lot. And why did it collapse? So it could have collapsed for a lot of reasons. For natural disaster, drought, also invasions is a big one. Some texts talk about the invasions of the sea people. So there are a lot of things going on in that time. The collapse in general was the downfall of the large civilizations of the Mediterranean around 1186 BC, and the devastation and destruction of many of their cities. Interestingly, these events seem to correspond to the 40 years in the wilderness that Moses and the Israelites spent, as well as the time of the Odyssey. So it's kind of interesting how you have these sea people who were kind of like wandering sailors, as well as Moses and the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, and Odysseus wandering to try and get home. It's kind of interesting how they correspond, and it could point to something. Perhaps God was trying to protect the Israelites from something. We don't really know what happened at the time. But this was about the same time as the collapse of the Bronze Age. Perhaps it had something to do with the invasions. So something interesting is that way later on, when the Romans were in power, there was an Israeli revolt, and the Romans kind of tamped it down. And to punish them, they named Israel after their worst enemy, which is the Philistines. So they named it Philistia. And that's actually where we get the name Palestine today. And so the Romans were known for doing things like this, very brutal punishments. One, for example, is the banishment of memory, which is where you destroy anything that references a person or a group of people that could be found by people, later historians. Another thing they did was when they took over Carthage, they plowed their fields with salt so that nothing would ever be able to grow there again. So this just kind of shows them being willing to utterly wipe people out from the eye of history, essentially. And so perhaps it was some sort of invading force like this that would do this, and that's why it's kind of a dark time in history and we don't really know what happened. So all this is due to the wave of archaeological expeditions started by Schliemann. And according to Peter T. Struck, quote, "Until about 100 years ago, we were quite sure that the Trojan War was purely legend," end quote. But that all had changed when, quote, archaeologists led by Heinrich Schliemann found the remains of the great citadel that existed in the western shore of Asia Minor, end quote. So on to point 3. we can learn about a lot about the language that Homer used. So one example is the colors that he talks about. So this is a very strange aspect of his writings. A man named William Gladstone noticed this. He was the Prime Minister of England, and he was a Homer fanatic. He noticed something interesting when he was reading Homer's writings, which is that he had the strange words for colors, like I said. One interesting thing is he says a word for purple or dark red in Greek, and he uses it to refer to things like blood or dark clouds, but also things like a wave or a rainbow. So he thought that the Greeks talked about color in kind of terms of dark and light hues dark and light rather than hues. That was kind of his conclusion. And many people were saying that he thought Greeks were colorblind, but he actually really wasn't saying this. He was saying that they didn't have a concept of blue. The color blue specifically was when he referred to the water as wine colored. And so he was saying that they weren't colorblind, they just didn't have a concept of these colors such as blue. And research seems to show that the Greeks actually didn't have a word for blue, likely. So something interesting is that usually societies develop words for colors when they can manufacture them reliably. And that's why societies tend to get a word for blue pretty late. So this is interesting, and this is kind of like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And that is that it is a theory that individuals' thoughts and actions are determined by the language they speak. So kind of the idea here is that the Greeks didn't have any concept of the color blue because it wasn't in their language because they hadn't really defined it. So Edward Sapir, one of the creators of the Sapir-Whorf theory, said, quote, the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built upon the language habits of the group, end quote. So kind of what he's saying there is like once you learn to define something, then you can learn to recognize it, and not before then. And so that kind of gives us an idea about how their culture functioned because of their manufacturing abilities. So another interesting thing is about the way that the story was passed down. So this was obviously recited by Homer, and Homer was a bard. So he would have said it orally, and he would not have had it written down. So this was kind of the way people passed on stories and things like that. It was kind of the way in general that culture and history were kept alive before most people could read. And so there were many interesting things we can learn about kind of the tradition of the bardic tradition from reading this story. So the Grimm brothers, who wrote many fairy tales, helped kind of start research on oral traditions, and they found many things. So you can find like hidden formulas and devices that he used to help remember the story, such as mnemonics. He also used repetition a lot, and so there are a lot of things we can learn about the tradition of like pre-literature literature, of oral literature. I don't think it's called literature, but you get the idea, the bardic tradition, from the way that this story was written, because it was actually put on paper, and that's why we have it today. So, although for most of history, Homer's writings have just been thought of as fiction, they are much more than simple mythology. Homer's writings provide us with essential insights into the late Bronze Age. They help shape the development and thinking of modern archaeology and its approach to the Greek world, and Homer's language offers insights into the Greek worldview. Thank you.